Well, okay, now that we've finished the scorer, it's time to move to the displayer. And we'll just go ahead and follow the same process that we did at the beginning. Create a new folder for our displayer tests. And go ahead and start creating an import for displayer tests. And then one last thing we're going to do is we're going to go ahead and put a false here as an optional third parameter to the score test. It simply isn't going to show us the test results for that. It's going to start opening that window that way. Okay, it's going to now complain that displayer tests is not available. So let's go ahead and write displayer.spec. And we're going to export our function displayer tests, and that's all that we'll have to do there. And go back and make sure that this is now clear. And it is. Okay, and now it's time to write our first displayer test. It's going to be test for, guess what, the empty game. We're going to use that a lot for our first tests. And let's go ahead and start writing the test for the empty game. We're going to run the displayer. And we're going to run it on the empty stream. And we're going to expect that the displayer run on that is going to be a stream of the empty string, which is what we expect to display there. And of course, we're going to have to go ahead and import things. And now it wants us to go ahead and create the displayer, faking it until we make it. And we can see that it's giving us the same two messages it gave us before. We haven't put in the parameter roles, so we will get the supplied parameter there. And we haven't given them a stream back, so let's go ahead and return observable.throw. No code here. And it's going to make us go ahead and define observable. And there it is, no code here. And we can see that we're ready to just go ahead and write a test. While we're here, we're still red. We can't go ahead and refactor, but we're red. So now we're going to go ahead and change the observable throw to observable empty, which is what the test requires. Actually, that's wrong. Observable of the empty string, which is what the test requires. And we're green. So now we're going to go ahead and now refactor this, and we're going to organize it so that we're going to say test, and we're going to run the for empty game, and we're going to run, what are we going to call it? Test displayer. Test display of, and now we're going to give it the stream, which will be, in this case, the empty stream. And we're going to expect the empty string back. And that would work fine if we actually had a function that did the test display. Let's go ahead and write function test display. And the parameters to that function are going to be the roles, the stream marbles for the roles, and then the string, the return, which is going to be the display, or what I'll say is the expected display. Okay, so let's go ahead and change this code a little bit. We're going to say expected here. Let's go ahead and put that there. And we're going to change observable.empty into roles. And we're going to use the marble to stream parameter function. of roles to get the stream there. And then we're going to go in here. So we're going to run displayer of roles, and it's going to be giving us the stream for expected. It's going to complain that we actually haven't got this defined because we don't. And it's complaining that it's not a function, as we discussed before. We're just going to return a function. And we're back to green, so our refactoring is complete, and now it's time for us to go ahead and do the next test, which we know is going to be the gutter. And the gutter is going to look like that. It's only taught to send back that empty string, so we're going to have to fix it so it returns the gutter. Okay, so we're going to actually get rid of the observable here and work from the parameter. And we'll map roles to be the gutter ball symbol. And we'll default, if it's empty, to be our empty stream. And there it is. We're green. We've handled that well. We can now refactor, get rid of that reference to observable. We're probably not going to use that again. And come back here. And it's time for us to do yet another test. But before we do that, we'll refactor there. After the gutter, we're going to go and do the strike. Although that was probably one of the hardest parts of scoring, it's probably one of the easiest portions of the displayer. The only trick here is that we have to put that space before the X, at least for now. And we're going to be red, and it's going to want that. So we're going to change this map to have a test to see, well, if roll is equal to 0, then that'll be what will respond. Otherwise, we're going to give the strike. And we're green, so let's go on to the next test, which is going to be the other. Okay, and so what happens when we just have to do a 1? We'll have a 1 without that space, and we're red. So now we're going to look up here, and so we're just going to have another test to distinguish 10, in which case we give the X, otherwise we'll give the 1. Now I'm using a slime here. I'm just putting in the constant. We know that there's more for us to do, but the test doesn't require it, and what's more, we need to understand the shape of what's going on. So let's go ahead and change that 1 to a 9. And now we're red again. And now we can look at ways to generalize. This is a great question in testing. When do I do my sliming? When do I do more testing? I know that I can actually go ahead and say, well, if the roll is equal to 1, then we're going to do that. Otherwise, we're going to go and do the 9. But look how much we have to type for that. The fact is, there's a different way we're going to do this, because there's a smaller, more simple way to do it. That works for all of these. Roll to string. It's a more general piece of code, but that more general piece of code is actually going to work well for everything. If I get rid of that semicolon there. And we're green. We generalize when the generalization is easier to write and easier to articulate and more obvious than anything else that we could do more specifically. So we handle that. We're green again, so it's time for us to do another test. Well, we've got all the single rolls done. Let's see what we can do for 2 rolls. And so let's have a a gutter ball and a 9. And that's what we would expect. And now we need to figure out how to generalize this piece of code. Well, we've got this function here that handles one roll. And what we really are going to do here is return rolls, and we're going to render it probably using reduce. We're going to have an ACK and a current, and it's going to go to take the ACK and add it to display one roll, a function we haven't yet written, which will pass ACK and cur to, and the default will be the empty string there. And in the meanwhile, let's put that in here. And we're green. So we also notice here that while we do have a display of empty, the reduce has already a default of the empty string, so we won't need that anymore as part of our refactoring. We're still functional, and it looks like we've got everything going except that semicolon there. So now we've accomplished what we need to do at many levels. And in fact, we may want to refactor this, display one roll. This whole function we may want to bring out. But before we do that, I don't see that we need to do that right now. Let's go ahead and start with our next one. So we've got two rolls, and we can handle that. So that's two rolls that basically for an open frame. So what happens when we have two rolls that sum? We've got a spare. And let's go back to our old example. That's the partial spare, and that's 5 slash. And it's going to notice that it doesn't give us 5 slash, it gives us 5 5. So we need to figure out how are we going to handle the spare. Well, let's go ahead and just add something up here that defines what the spare is. What happens when the current plus the last roll, which will be gathered up in the accumulator. So it's the accumulator, and the accumulator length minus 1. But that's the string, that's just the character. So let's stick a parse int here. And the problem is with that parse int, we have the hyphen, which we're going to have to correct to a 0. And so we need that whole expression to be equal to 10. And if that's the case, we're going to ask it to go ahead and display the slash. But that's yeah, and that's probably right. So let's go ahead and see how that works. But we see now that we've got the slash is coming up as an answer when we get to 10. We also want to make sure that it's a time for a spare attempt. Otherwise, it's going to correct all of our strikes. So let's go ahead and define what we mean when we're able and available to do a spare attempt. And that would be when the accumulator length is odd. And then that the sum of those things is equal to 10. And that excludes that. So now we're green, and obviously we need to do some refactoring here. So the constant is a spare attempt. And then we have this expression here, which looks like it's going to be useful. and that's going to be last roll. So when cur plus the last roll is equal to 10, and let's actually take that whole thing and call it if it is spare. Okay, and we've got a couple of constants here. This current equal 10 is a gutter ball. And finally, this one is a strike. And frankly, display one roll looks pretty clean. Actually, it looks very clean. And rolls, and so now we're handling gutters, strikes, spares, and others, and we're able to handle 1, 2, 3 to 20 of those, and all the way up to a complete game. So all we really need to do is make sure that we're handling the edge cases, which are always in the 10th frame. So let's go ahead and create a test here for the 10th frame. And let's create some constants which will be helpful in expressing these tests. We're going to call it a prefix for the rolls. And that's going to be basically the gutter ball. And how many times? We have a guttering out for 9 frames, so that would be 18. Like that. And then another constant would be the pre-scores. And that's going to be, not pre-scores, pre-display. And that's going to be, I guess, 18 gutter balls, 18 hyphens, right? Okay, and now we're ready to write a test. So the first test will just be, well, we've already got the spare. How about a spare starting the 10th frame? So we have a 10th frame that begins with a spare, and we're going to have the pre-rolls, because we know the open frames are going to work. There's open frames for the 10th frame are no different than anything else. But the pre-rolls when we now have a spare, so let's put it 5, 5. And we'd expect that to be 5 spare, like that. Plus that. And that's really going to be that game, and that works just fine. So now we've got the test spare, and now we have the spare followed by non-strike. So that would be 5 there. Or I guess let's just make that a tradition of making that a gutter ball. In fact, let's make those gutter balls. Make sure that works. And that did. So now we're going to have a spare, non-spare. And so we add the 0 there, and we have that. And that works. And then we have a spare and a strike. And notice there is a little difference here that I think we're going to be able to see right now. Yes, as you can see here, we don't have that extra space. We need to break that out. So let's go ahead and write the test to handle that. So here we have a strike, and what we're going to do here is take a look at the accumulator. When its length, when the display so far has a length that's equal to 18. That's the first roll of the 10th frame. Then we would add the x, but if this is the case, then we would want a blank. Otherwise, we're going to go ahead and give the space. Okay, so here we're going to make that length 20 because it's the last roll of the game, the 21st roll, and that leaves us to making that green. Okay, so now we go back and we've got the spare strike. So now it's time to move on. What happens if we roll a strike the first frame? And we see we have the same problem. We're putting a space there. We're going to be growing this. We could say act length is equal to 20 or is equal to 18. Or we could say it's greater than or equal to 18. Since we know that a strike in the second frame probably needs to be picked up that way too and scored. For example, if you have a double, you don't need an extra space. So we're going to go ahead and now take this time to refactor this. And we're going to call this space unless 10th of the accumulator. And get rid of that extra foliage there. And we've handled the strike situation for that. And what happens when we have a strike and a non-strike? Okay, and that's handled right. A strike and a non-strike, so that doesn't require any change in code. And then what happens after we have the non-strike? Let's make that a spare. And it displays that as a 10th frame strike instead of the spare. And that's because it's not aware that it's actually a spare roll. Or this with act.length is equal to 20. And in that scenario, even though the length now is 20, not a 21, it will still be a spare attempt because there was a strike in the first frame that took up that spot. And that's okay and fixes our test there. But notice it messes this up, the original spare strike. So what we really want to do is add to that the ank length is equal to 20, and that the first roll of the 10th frame was a strike. And now we're green. Okay, so that took care of that situation, and that looks good. Let's go ahead and see what else. We've got strike and a spare. So now let's go handle strikes followed by an open frame. Should have done that here. So we have a strike and an open frame. And that will give us a pre-display, which is going to be a strike and a total open frame. That should actually go through without difficulty. Okay, and a strike and a spare. So now we're going to look at doubles. We've already taken care of getting rid of the space for doubles on that frame. And now it sees the second 10 as though it were a spare attempt. Why it's showing that as a spare, I'm not really sure, but let's go ahead and figure out a way. It sees a double as a spare attempt. Okay, so we have 19 rolls, and that would come here, and that would look here like it would be a spare attempt. So we've got to fix it so it's not. In the case that ACK is not 19, really does look like all we need to do here is say that ACK.length is not equal to 19. Does that solve that? Yes, it does, but it makes a mess of the beginning here. You see over here, so we mean more than just that it's not 19, and we're green. Okay, so we're going to have to take a look at this. It's a double opportunity, and it's not going to be a spare, even though the length is 19, because it's a double scenario. It's not the second frame. It won't be a spare opportunity. It's a double opportunity, not a spare opportunity. Okay, so let's go back. And we've got the doubles right. And now we have the turkey. And we would display a turkey as 3 X's. But no, it treats it like a spare opportunity. And that's absolutely going to be a problem because it's not a spare opportunity. But what we've got here is this scenario, which is giving it permission. So we need to do this, that ACK of 19 is not equal to a spare. And that should complete our testing. And it does. Okay, we've handled all these situations. It's time for, I guess, a little bit of, and this is an odd frame scenario, and this is a double opportunity. So and we don't want that 19th there, so we have that it's odd and not a double opportunity. Or this scenario, which I guess how do we describe those in words? Is a strike spare opportunity, I guess. Make sure we haven't broken anything, and no, we haven't. And that'll make this a little bit more easier. Let's say this is an odd. So it's a spare attempt if it's an odd roll and not a double attempt, or if it's a strike spare attempt, which is always going to be on a situation other than the odd roll. I think we can now safely say we're done, and we are. So now we're done. We have accomplished the displayer, and we're ready to move on to the next module, which is going to be the enabler, which will look a little bit like the displayer, and then we're ready to start writing our user interface. This is pretty well tested and pretty comprehensively tested for the 10th frame. So now it's time to move on to the enabler.